So first of all, what do we know already? What do we know about the needs of Ukrainians coming to the UK, and how can the new schemes meet these needs? What are the lessons to be learned from the Afghan, Hong Kong and Syrian schemes? What lessons can we learn about integration to inform the development of the Ukraine humanitarian scheme, including from business, civic and civil society? With the government engaged in these three major welcoming programmes with distinct cohorts and challenges, are there opportunities for policy and civic community to make useful links across these schemes? And what can this scheme bring? What is missing? What should the government's approach to welcoming Ukrainian refugees look like in full? So we've got a panel of speakers to start with. We've got Dr. Olga Onuk, if that's how I pronounce that, Monica Reset, Orisia Lutsevich, and Sabir Zazai. So, Dr. Olga, if I could go to you first of all, could you first of all introduce yourself, and if you can respond to this particular question in light of my headline questions, what is your perspective of the situation in the Ukraine and the opportunity to welcome those fleeing to the UK, given your expertise?
Right, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Olga Onuk. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and I run a major project called Mobilize, where we study the behavior of Ukrainians both at home and abroad. I think 2 points that I would like to start off with in the first instance in answering your question. We are, as of today, the IOM has announced that we are at 3 million already displaced people outside of the border of Ukraine. That's not counting the displacement within Ukraine. That is a number that we reached after years when it comes to other recent refugee flows. So this is immense. Of that population, daily, it is estimated by UNICEF that 75,000 of those individuals are children, meaning 55 children a minute are fleeing Ukraine across the borders. So to that end, there's two things I would like us to consider amongst Ukrainians. Who are the Ukrainians fleeing? And what does that mean here in the UK and already the diaspora and community networks that we have in place? So in terms of who are the populations, we know that this is predominantly mothers with children, although not only. There are numerous unaccompanied minors. So far in the UK, we do not have any scheme or protection in place for this community in particular. And we also know that there is vulnerable populations among the elderly. These are individuals that are in fact unlikely to make the journey across the European continent and into the UK. But nonetheless, this is not something that we are very prepared yet to handle. We also know that these are, for at least in this first wave of displacement, that these are individuals with language capacity. They're fairly well networked in the UK specifically across diasporic networks, but also across professional networks. And they have high human and social capital, as we would call it in our sector. We should be ready beginning is a very different group, will require further support. I think that is not yet currently in place when it at least comes to the schemes that we have in the UK. In terms of Ukrainians in the UK, we know that they are also across Northwest, in addition to some other islands of clustering in Coventry, Nottingham, Birmingham, and elsewhere. Some of these localities are already very, very well organized with Ukrainian communities of a variety of flavors and religious organizations. Other parts, like in Birmingham, the community is actually not set up or networked very well at all, but there is a large population of Ukrainians there. And of the points that we have now a 25-person strong academic task force in place, and we are collectively organizing something called Ukraine Hub UK, where we are trying to coordinate amongst Ukrainian community organizations, the higher education institutions and sector, as well as student organizations. And we are noticing that there's a lot of duplication of efforts, a lot of unclarity about government policy, unclarity where the policy will be moving next, because it has been explained that this is a stepped scheme. This is a multi-phase scheme. We are to expect more changes to this scheme. And what the role of Ukrainian community might be in the support and aiding of this this displaced community, beyond that of individual responsibility that the scheme currently is focusing on. And lastly, we have noted in our task force meeting this morning that we are slightly worried that the higher education sector at this point in time is actually potentially duplicating efforts and trying to employ the Tier 5 visa route to welcome scholars at risk. We think that this needs to be a little bit explored in order not to duplicate procedures and routes that are available to us. Lastly, we have thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of international students that are going to be directly affected, and if within 3, 6, or 9 months will become displaced people themselves. And this is not only Ukrainian students, this also does affect Belarusian and Russian students who may not find it safe to return. And our task force would like to make the key note here that the UK does have a duty of care to these students who have, in some cases, been here for 3 years of study. I have more data on the population in Ukraine. This is a population that will likely want to return. Our own survey data shows this. We continue to survey the displaced people as well as diaspora communities. But in Ukraine, we know that 97% of those still in Ukraine would like to stay, and a similar number of those displaced would like to return.
Olga, Olga, can I just stop you there, because I'm just conscious that we've only
sorry, go ahead.
It's fine. It's just that we've only got Monica with us for a few more minutes before she needs to leave. So I don't want to cut you off, because what you're saying is incredibly helpful and valuable. But if we can go to Monica now, because I know she's only with us for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Peter. And Ola, I'm so sorry. I know that that's incredibly inconvenient, and I really appreciate you bearing with me. I do have only about 5 or 10 minutes to be with you, but it's brilliant to have this opportunity to be with you. Let me try and be as quick as I can to share with you the things I did want to share with you. So just in case you don't know, I'm Monica Kruzman, co-director of Reset Communities and Refugees. We are the charity which has been working across the last few years to lead and grow community-led welcome across the UK. So we've had deep experience with the Syrian scheme, we've had deep experience with the Afghan scheme, we've touched also with the people coming from Hong Kong, and we're quite deeply into this scheme at the moment as well. Lots of things that I'd like to share with you. I suppose I would state my kind of top level position coming from our experiences that we do welcome this announcement. We know from our experience that the people across the UK are both intensely willing and absolutely able to step up and be involved with this welcoming activity. Like all of you, we have received tens of thousands of inquiries in the last week from people who want to be involved, who've pledged their support. So the appetite is absolutely there. What we do know also from our experience with community-led welcome is that appetite is hard to sustain for a long period of time. So speed is of the essence. And we do understand that it's a really complex program to put together, but we welcome what we have seen in terms of, trying to get things happening quickly. In practical terms, there are lots and lots of technical details still being worked out. And we, like many others, are working closely with the Department for Levelling Up and Home Office to support them on their respective ends of the scheme, the sponsorship scheme. Lots of practical things we could talk about. One particular thing that I want to highlight to you, because I know it's things that we think about a lot at Reset, and you will all have been asked a lot of questions about it. But one thing that's very different about this scheme compared with the Syrian scheme and the Afghan scheme, and indeed all of the ones before, is that this scheme requires naming between the sponsor and the person who's going to be sponsored. That is completely different from any experience we've had previously. And I think that that's fundamentally for this circumstance, and given the need for speed, because the moment of need, the moment of compassion is now, I think that's a positive thing. But it's also not straightforward. And what we know is, and many of you will have had these questions, what we know is that most people who are coming forward to pledge their support don't already know people in the Ukraine. Similarly, most of the people who are fleeing Ukraine, and Ola, it was so brilliant to hear from you the characteristics of these people. Most of those people don't know somebody in the UK that they can name to sponsor them. So what we have been doing at Reset at pace 24/7 the last few days has been establishing a matching interface. It's an online portal. It will go live any minute now. It's literally imminent. And this will be a mechanism for matching for prospective hosts and Ukrainians who want to be sponsored, who are in need, to get their details into the system and be matched, prospectively to be matched with each other, so that then they can go forward into the government system for the visa application, which requires that you are already connected. So this is the matching portal will come forward quite quickly. And that's one thing I wanted to share with you. As soon as it's live, we'll be going out across our networks. We'll be going out as wide as possible with both the details, and there'll be lots and lots of questions about that. We know there'll be questions about data security, about safeguarding, about all of those kind of things. And we will be certainly sharing as much as we can on that in the next days. Ola, that might help as well, because there is, the last time I looked, which was half an hour ago, there is a question in there for people coming from Ukraine to note if they, at the time of the crisis, were registered as tertiary students in the Ukraine. And the idea is then that they could be matched, because we know we've got universities coming forward who want to be involved in this scheme. We've got about 15 separate universities registered and pledging their support at the moment. The idea is that we could try and quickly match those students with those institutions as well. Lots going on there. Your agenda just quickly also has questions about the lessons that can be learned from the previous schemes. And I think that's really important. One of the things that I would flag from our experience, particularly with the Syrian and the Afghan schemes, is that there does absolutely need to be a robust and relevant training and support mechanism for both the hosts and the newcomers. So I think none of us should be under any illusions, although the appetite to support is immense. We shouldn't be under any illusions that hosting is a simple activity. It's really not. It's a massive undertaking. Where it works well, and we've seen this particularly in community sponsorship, it's absolutely transformative. And our Reset website for the core community sponsorship program, we've got a whole series of what we call stories from sponsorship, and it's people talking about how this has been an absolutely extraordinary, life-changing, positive experience for themselves and their community. It doesn't always work out like that, and I think we need to be proactive in thinking about contingency plans, and we need to make sure that the structures for support for hosts and for newcomers are in place as quickly as possible. Local authorities will certainly have a role to play there, but this is also a place, and this is one of your other questions, where we could link into some of the expertise and some of the resource of the previous community-led welcome schemes. I was on a call this morning with experienced folks from the community sponsorship movement, and they were already suggesting to say, well, my group has experience, we welcomed a family, why couldn't we be in touch with new hosts and offer to support and guide them? So I think there's something really, really good in terms of community capacity building and linking that could happen there. Lots and lots of questions as well. You had a question about, what are the kind of strengths and weaknesses with the scheme? I'm sure we're all getting asked the same kind of questions, particularly what is going to happen at the end of the minimum 6-month housing period. That's a really, really important question, and I think needs to be dealt with quite quickly. Safeguarding, massive issue. We know that DBS checks will be in place. We've talked about light touch security checking for both newcomers and for hosts. I think that's a really, really sensitive area, and we need to be careful about that. There are questions for local authorities and the stretch that this will put onto local services. We know that local authorities are going to receive a £10,500 payment per person who arrives under this hosting scheme. But in terms of what other obligations they might have or how that's going to work, I think that's a really, really urgent question that needs to be dealt with. And then I can see, Sophia, you're with us, which is completely brilliant. Our colleagues and friends in the devolved nations have got their own specific sets of issues that they need to be working through as well. And I think we need to really be connected and conscious of that, and make sure that we don't end up with another scheme that works for one part of the UK and not for the other parts of the country as well. So I so appreciate your time, and I'm just so sorry to drop off after that, like just the verbal blast of information. But if I can help or support or give you any more information online afterwards, then I'm really standing by to do so.
Monica, can I thank you for your contribution? It's very valuable. I appreciate you've got to go, but please don't hesitate to feed anything in via email directly to Sunda and Lucy to feed into our report. So I appreciate you've got to go, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and really my apologies for dropping out so soon.
No worries,
it's great to see you.
No worries, thank you. And in a very similar vein, if we can go to Sabir now, who is only able to stay with us until 3 o'clock. Sabir, can I come to you, please?
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be connected and good to see some familiar faces and old colleagues and friends. I think I want to approach this from two perspectives. One is what are the opportunities and what are the risks? I think the opportunities are that we need to capitalize and build on the outpouring of generosity that is coming through. And I think that is unprecedented. Whilst we're dealing with unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, we're seeing unprecedented response here from communities, from businesses, from individuals towards refugees, towards people fleeing Ukraine. But I think that needs to be capitalized and invested in. If we put a ring around it and ring fence that compassion, I think there is a huge risk as well. We need to let it flow. We need to make sure that it is that kind of like public movement building that is that is organic, and I think we need to make sure that that happens. So the opportunity is there. What we need to do is again, focusing on the opportunities, is that our approach, what the UK does in terms of both the schemes, but also our overall response to Ukraine, is that our response needs to be reflective of, first of all, the gravity of the situation in Ukraine. What are people fleeing? And secondly, it needs to also be reflective of the goodwill, generosity that people are showing towards refugees. And I think the risk is there that if we welcomed somebody, let's say on a family scheme or sponsorship, well, that is fine. We'll have people supporting that person. If a woman from Ukraine arrived with 2 children under the new borders, nationality and borders bill, then there needs to be some clarity on what is the prospect of integration and future of her life here in the UK. And similarly, if a woman from Afghanistan arrived, or Syria and others, so I think there needs to be a comprehensive approach to our reception of refugees and then looking into their integration and them being part of our society. So the other opportunities also, as Monica said earlier, is to build on existing mechanisms that all of us, including I see colleagues here, Tim Finch and others, have spent years to build this. So in Scotland, for example, we've got the new Scots Refugee Integration Strategy. I think there could be a UK wide approach to integration. What integration means, how do we want to integrate people? How do we support them? And within that, I think there needs to be a rights-based approach, integration from day one, because again, the risk is that people may arrive, and if we don't invest in them, if we don't engage them with our society, if we don't give them the opportunities to contribute, we will miss out, but we will also end up with a community that will be disenfranchised, which again is the risk.
So, can I just press you there? You posed an awful lot of rhetorical questions back to the discussion there. Could I just press you in terms of delivering on some suggested answers to those questions that you've posed there?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that whatever our approach is to welcoming people, their welcome needs to be based on rights. So people need to have access to all the rights that are afforded to every member of the society. I think that is very important, because people need to have access to employment, people need to have access to advice, they need to have access to safeguarding services. There is issues around vetting, and I think again we need to explore that as to how best the vetting could be done in terms of engaging people with sponsors, and I think looking at this as a longer term battle in a way. The quick fixes might be helpful at certain stages, but what we do need is longer term plan for integration of these communities. I know some of them might want to go back, others might want to stay, but what we need to do is our focus and approach needs to be based on the assumption that these people want to have prosperous lives here. They want to be able to work, they want to be able to contribute. And I think, again, going back to your lesson of learning from the Afghan and the Syrian schemes is, Mr. that if we want to learn from the Afghan scheme, sadly, although our approach has been all well meant, integration for brave Afghans who fled in August last year has still not started because they're still in hotel rooms. And from my experience as a former refugee, integration does not begin in the back of a hotel room. It begins in our communities, it begins in our neighborhoods. So how soon can we get these communities into our neighborhoods and communities? So I think if we're learning from the Afghan, the learning is that we don't want people to be in short-term accommodation for too long because integration does not kickstart for them there. And I think also in terms of the point that was made around understanding our society and our culture and values and others, I think it's also very important that there is an element of not just integration, but orientation as well, getting to know how things work here in the UK. How can you apply for jobs? Because yeah, you're coming to a different place, and I think the risk that there is, and I will finish off with this. We need to not shy away from risks as well. We're facing difficult economic times in our society and in the UK, and inevitably there will be some negativity as well, where some people might say refugees get it easy, they get equipment, they get all the support. What about our homeless? What about our jobless, and so on? And I think the government needs to be prepared to manage that. Not that I'm suggesting that there are quite a lot of really well-meant people who are supporting, but we also need to be prepared for negativity as well, where people might use this as an opportunity to have a go at the government or have a go at those in power. The very final line is, I think we are doing a great job. There is a lot happening. Refugees, when people are forced to flee their homes, they need leadership, they need collaboration. These are two key things. And sadly, there is some need and there's a lack of coherence between all that we do. So, for example, yeah, we need to address the lack of coherence between DLUC, Cabinet Office, Number 10, and Home Office, and then the devolved powers as well, because we all want to help, but we don't want to end up stepping over one another to help refugees. So I'll finish off with
just on that specific point, could I just ask you to comment in respect of the appointment of Lord Harrington last week, who's obviously reporting into two government departments in order to tackle and bridge that problem?
Yes.
What specific advice would you have for him, bearing in mind his experience in the role previously?
So I'm going to meet him next week with Michael Gove. We've had discussions with his office last week through Sue Gray. I think I passed on some stuff to Sue Gray, but I think the advice would be that if there is guidance coming out and there are decisions being made on these schemes that have already been advertised, I think we need to be very specific. It needs to be very clear because, Peter, I'd say, I know I've been working in this sector for 20 years. I find some of that guidance very confusing. But just imagine you're fleeing a war and then you have to read all these things and they keep changing as well. So that will be one bit of really quick advice to say, people need very clear, direct humanitarian routes to seek protection, not complexity.
Thanks, Sabir. I'm going to turn to Tim Finch, if I may now. Tim, you were trailed in Sabir's responses. Do you have anything to contribute to the discussion and the questions that I raised at the outset?
Well, just picking up on a couple of points that Sabi has said, which I agree with, but possibly from slightly different angles. I certainly think that the not shying away from risks is a really important issue at this time, because if this is going to work, then we're going to have to take some risks, and we're going to have to take some risks with some quite sensitive things. If the process of finding these sponsors, and indeed finding the support that the sponsors will need, because the sponsor under this scheme will be in effect an individual or a household offering accommodation for short term. They're going to need some help from their community or their neighbours, and that group of people in turn are going to need some support in the background as well. I mean, my experience of community sponsorship is that one thing you can be absolutely certain of is that the community sponsorship groups, and there's no reason to suppose this won't be true this time round, have enormous amounts of capability. I mean, you're invariably talking about people, although they're volunteers and in a sense amateurs, and sometimes refugee professionals can be a bit sniffy about that. They're very qualified people. In most community sponsorship groups contain someone who knows a lot about safeguarding, if not several people who know a lot about safeguarding, people with experience of the region, experience with refugees, teachers, lawyers, people with language skills. They are high caliber people, and I suspect that a large number of people coming forward will be like that, but what they will also be is new to doing this, whatever this actually amounts to. So there'll need to be some support behind that. But I think all of that can be put in place as we do the registration processes now. And observing some of the comments I've seen, just sort of on my own social media things from people I've known in the sector for many years, is there's quite a lot of contradictory messages coming out, which I hope we don't get too bogged down in. So there's there's a lot of says we've got to move quickly, and then here's a whole load of reasons why we can't move quickly, or let's cut out all the red tape and bureaucracy, and then subsequent to that, here's a whole load of bureaucracy that needs to be added in. Let's make it fast, but let's make it slow. Let's make it easy, but let's make it difficult. And I think we've got to get away from that. If we are going to do something quickly, then we need to start with something which, as Sabi has said, is specific and clear, is prepared to take a few risks, but moves quickly. And I think that's absolutely essential. And then I just think the only other point I would join in on at this stage is one that relates to what Ola had said, and indeed Zabia touched on it, and Monica. I do think it's quite a good idea to assume, as Zabia said, that these are people who are going to stay here for the longer term. It may be the case that this is an unusual refugee population, and that, God willing, the situation settles down in Ukraine quite quickly and people want to return. But it has to be said that that isn't the experience of previous conflicts. However much refugees arrive saying they want to go back, in most cases they don't go back for all sorts of reasons, partly because of the situation in their country, but often because they've built a new life here. So I do think that assumption is really, really important. As it happens, all the things that Zabia is asking for, I think, are built into the scheme. They are going to have the rights from the moment they arrive, and that is really, really important. But to exercise those, they will need concentric circles of support. So the sponsor is one of them. The group of people who cluster around the sponsor is another. The background people, what we call in the community sponsorship movement, the lead sponsor group, that will need some support and funding, and new people can enter into doing that, and then government and local authorities. But what's so important, I think, at this stage, is to maintain a sort of relentlessly positive attitude to this scheme. You can pick holes in it. You can say it's too late and it's too little, but it's here. It's what we've got. It's not bad at all, I don't think. And I think it's absolutely imperative that everybody leans in. And if you don't want to lean in, then just get out of the way, quite frankly. And I think there's enough people who are up for this across all the sectors who are involved to make this work. So I'd say I'm incredibly positive about this, and I think that positivity needs to be kept on. That drum needs to keep on being banged.
Tim, can I welcome your comments? I'm usually a relentlessly positive person myself, so meeting someone who wants us to be relentlessly positive is a good thing. And I know from the conversations that I've had with the team at British Future, we want the report that comes out from this examination today to be relentlessly positive about how we can help that social integration. Can I turn to Luke Trill from Maureen Common? Luke, I believe you are with us. I have actually, just before this, left a meeting with Kim Ledbetter. So good to meet with you. And if you could respond to the points that others have made and the questions that I posed at the very beginning, please.
Absolutely. And others who have far more experience and track record in working with refugees and refugee communities will be better placed to comment on sort of the mechanics and workings of the schemes. I guess what I can tell you is that we spend a lot of our time talking to the public and engaging with them across a huge range of different issues. And it won't surprise you that our focus in recent weeks has been on Ukraine. And I just wanted to feed back some of what we're getting from those focus group conversations, largely in what's become known as the Red Wall, because we spend a lot of our time there trying to understand different communities, particularly those who often feel voiceless. And the first thing to say is that even amongst those who typically feel quite disengaged from current affairs, the Ukraine crisis and invasion has immensely high salience. People are following it in real time, and that is triggering a real sort of human emotion, which is translating into people's attitudes towards refugees. So before this scheme was announced, we spoke to some groups who, and again, they might be the groups you might expect to be slightly skeptical towards migration and refugees, and they couldn't understand why what they perceived as Home Office bureaucracy and paperwork was getting in the way of us bringing people over and welcoming them to the UK and providing a safe haven. And that is quite unusual in terms of the reaction to refugees. And that's, in part it's due to the high salience, in part it's due to what Olga said. People recognise that it's likely to be largely women and children who are coming over in the first wave. And there is this sense that it will be temporary. So I think my only caution to others is we should obviously be prepared for people being here for the long haul. But I think a bit of the kind of public support is predicated on the idea that this is a sort of temporary, we're going to have people here whilst, they need a home, with the idea that they go back, and we just need to make sure our messaging is there. I think the second thing that I would say is that people also, we push people quite hard on the fact that, this conflict is going to have consequences for us here at home. To Zabir's point, there is going to be hardship. And at the moment, people are willing to bear that, but it's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on as the full impact of sanctions comes to as the cost of living rises. No doubt attitudes will change, and it will be important to track and keep an eye on that as well. But I think the third thing, and I think this ties in with what Tim was saying, is that there is, as I say, we've seen it not just from our focus groups, but from the numbers signing up, there is huge appetite and willingness to help. Now, that won't be sponsorship for everyone. For other people, it will be donations, it will be volunteering, it will be helping. We need to be thinking about how we make that as easy as possible, and that we ensure that this initial enthusiasm, the 100,000 who have, registered an interest, we need to be making it easy to turn that into active matching. At the moment, it's through naming, but obviously phase 2 will be a broader phase, which allows organizations and groups, because my fear is, and we've seen this in other areas, is that if people feel that their desire and willingness to help and that real enthusiasm isn't being met with an opportunity to contribute, that it could actually end up undermining support for the scheme and the Welcome programme in general. What we're also interested in as well is, and you proposed the question about what does this mean for kind of other schemes and other areas, is, one of the things we want to look at is whether the sort of generosity we've seen here will now extend more broadly, and whether it leads to a sort of paradigm shift in people's attitudes to refugees. We don't have as much evidence on that yet, but it's certainly something that we're looking at. And then the final thing that I would just say is that linked to that is we've also done a bit of polling, and what's so interesting is that when you poll and ask people about taking refugees in general, this without looking at the context of Ukraine, is that you get, broad support for taking in refugees from areas of conflict. When you pitch it in sponsorship terms, across the board, you get a 12-point jump in public support, because it ties into that narrative of people being able to take control. This is people saying, we're stepping up, we're doing something. And what's particularly interesting is the jump is highest amongst those groups who are normally most immigration skeptical. So if you look at, say, Brexit voters in the red wall, they are the groups who are most likely to switch from opposition to support when it comes to sponsorship. So I think we've got a real opportunity here, as Tim says, both to take advantage of public enthusiasm, but also to shift attitudes to refugees and migration in general by pitching it as something that isn't something being sort of imposed from elsewhere, but it's people stepping up and taking control and saying, this is what we want to do as a community.
Luke, that's really fascinating. And that comment that you made about Brexit red wall voters jumping more higher than anybody else is really key. I just wonder if I can drill down a little bit further in the comment that you made with regards to people's sense of willingness to help and support because they see it as being transigent and a temporary thing. When you also mentioned the cost of living problems that we are experiencing, pressure on household incomes, and we can anticipate further problems with demand on local resources, health service, doctors, dentists, etc. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts and comments about how we tackle that integration piece there with that kind of pro-Brexit red wall contingent who are probably have been the most vocal against immigration and are most vocal about the demand on their services. So what is the tipping point and how do we not get to that tipping point?
I think that's a really important point. And I think, as others have mentioned, I think the sort of how we handle the sort of integration, getting people opportunities piece really matters. So I think one of the great things about this sponsorship scheme is that people will be able to work straight away. And again, when we've asked people in focus groups, they say, well, of course people should be working whilst they're over here. So it's that sense that people are putting back in. I think it's going to have to come alongside, and I appreciate this is beyond the remit of this group, but the extent to which cost of living, and this won't surprise you, Peter, from your surgeries, in other words, the extent to which cost of living is coming up in our focus groups is so strong. I think, this is going to have to come alongside whatever other targeted support the Chancellor gives to help people with cost of living, because there is a danger that unaddressed that people do feel the squeeze, and it tends to be people on lower incomes who are going to feel the squeeze the most. They're going to have to be supported through that. But I think that the main thing is that we have a proper there's proper support, that local authorities get the support they need so that there isn't extra pressure on services. People aren't seeing this as us and them competing for the pie at the moment. So the way we allocate support and services is going to matter to keep it like that.
Okay, that's really, really nice that you said that. It's not an us and them, it's we're all in this together in effect. 10 days out from the Chancellor's budget, I'm able to claim complete impartiality in terms of what he's about to announce. I know that he's mentioned that he's addressing those issues, and I'm sure that he will. Sadly, we've lost Seema from Ernst & Young, but her colleague Anthony Rain, I believe, is on the call as well. Anthony, can I turn to you for you to outline, if you can, the work that you have been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. So I work with Seema Farazi at EY. One of the things that we've been involved with now since last summer is something called the Refugee Connect framework. So this is something that we as a sector, so when I talk about sector, I talk about the professional business services sector. That includes your advertisers, your accountants, your lawyers, your recruiters. So we've been working within the constraints of the Professional Business Services Council to help build this framework with a charity called REN. So REN are the Refugee Employment Network. And this is all about helping refugees to enter into meaningful employment. So when last summer happened, there was a great deal amount of obviously public outcry, alongside what you're probably sort of seeing now. But I think there was some of the individuals that we were coming through, and I know from my own network, and I'm ex-British Army, and I was seeing individuals come through that had a lot of skills, and I was trying to help them on my own, try and find employment coming through on the various schemes, and it was incredibly difficult. So a group of us, within the sector, saying, look, we must be able to try and do something. So we've been building this framework for, I guess, since last August. With the view of, I guess, using something called a hub and spokes model, where you would have REN as the hub, helping to coordinate the various sort of spokes. So that might be a focus around employment, or it might be around how do we help provide training opportunities to bring these individuals sort of coming through into employment as quickly as possible. And obviously that's quite difficult, because there are obviously a lot of issues around screening. There are issues around accommodation that we've already sort of heard about today, and that's sort of affecting people and individuals sort of getting work. But we're working alongside the Home Office, or working alongside the DWP, and we've got an increasing number of organisations and businesses wanting to play a part, and we're at the stage where we're building a pilot with some recruitment companies, which will be working with REN to help bring individuals sort of through this sort of model, and helping to sort of direct them to work that is available. And the focus is to try and, this coalition of the willing, so to speak, to try and identify what jobs there are available, and to kind of put them into one place with REN, for them to kind of help then to triage essentially, and direct people in the right place with their sort of wider network. So I think that's a summary of kind of what we're doing. Some of the lessons learned that we're kind of coming through, and obviously there's obviously everyone, majority of people here know far greater than I do about sort of the refugee sector. But the one thing that is kind of certainly to my mind, coming through and trying to learn from the previous scheme, is when it's not just about what, for us from an employment perspective, when you get that individual a job, but how do you support that individual once they've got a job? How do you, because inevitably, certainly whether it's Ukraine or Afghanistan, people are coming into this country with a great deal of trauma, a great deal of upheaval, and how do you kind of help and settle them and integrate them, not just within their communities, but within their jobs, so they're not suddenly going, I can't do this after a month of employment, and they're back in the cycle again. So trying to sort of build in those mechanisms, those support mechanisms within for employers, certainly I think is going to be incredibly important, and we need to be thinking about that as well. What support employers are willing to sort of put in. It's not just about getting them through the door into the job, but this is going to take a good deal of time.
Anthony, can I just drill down a little bit further in terms of what the Refugee Employment Network's doing? Is that actually bringing together employers who've got demands of a particular sector and particular skill set with the skills of the refugees? And you talk about the perhaps mental difficulties that somebody might have having escaped conflict and trauma. And are you feeding into those individuals some sort of mental health support in respect of that?
So maybe I'll just tackle on your second question first of all. I think us as a sector professional service, that we are not certainly equipped to do that. We are not specialists in that, and I think there are many sort of capable organisations that can do that much sort of better than us.
But do you do signposting if you're aware of that?
So yes, of course. So the idea, so REN is quite a young charity, and we are helping to, as a sector, essentially kind of capacity and capability build. So what I mean by that, as in improve its website and functioning, so then we can actually signpost to the relevant organisations that can do the work that you've said is incredibly important. To your first question, so REN, they are essentially the hub. So they have got over 140 sort of members. I think the Refugee Council is one of them. So they're essentially, their caseworkers will go to them and we'll be sort of speaking to what jobs are available, what training programs are available, and so what we've been doing at the moment as a professional business service sector is to say, well, how can we leverage our network to bring in the right training organizations that we know are offering to do something, but also we've got organizations that recognize that refugees are joining here with some great skills and some great talent, and we need to sort of plug that gap. So they are essentially that coordinating head, essentially.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm gonna circle right all the way back to Olga now that we've had everyone has had the chance to speak, but particularly in respect of that last point that Anthony made about that mental health difficulty, people escaping trauma and conflict, and what we perhaps need to do in terms of that integration that we perhaps haven't done in the past. What lessons can we learn this time to make sure that the necessary sort of support and counselling is delivered as part of that resettlement? Olga, if I can come back to you, because I know we had to sadly cut you off in mid-flow at the very start. So if there's other points that you didn't get a chance to sort of share with us at the very beginning as well.
So I couldn't have agreed more with our colleagues' points throughout the discussion. I think the issue around well-being and mental health of mothers fleeing with children, often at a moment's notice, and leaving their partners behind, and also not only the trauma of experiencing violence and threat, and then the journey that they must take to get to the United Kingdom, but also the fact that they are away from their partners and do not have that support. I think that's going to be a very particular a layer of complexity, because many of their husbands are, in fact, according to our data, 39% will have already volunteered towards the war effort. So they will be living that reality in a different way. So if you can imagine accountants from a variety of places in the city or elsewhere that are now volunteers in the war effort, and their partners and children will be coming to the United Kingdom as they are experiencing the threat of violent conflict daily. So I think certainly the Ukrainian communities, the higher education sector around those communities can support in well-being and mental health. But I think a specific program around this element, essentially single parenting, that is new to thousands of individuals within days. I do want to note the integration issue. I am an expert on Ukrainian politics. I do expect a large portion of these individuals to return precisely because their partners are in Ukraine. And from all of our data, we would expect a larger portion than we would normally expect to return. So in our communication to welcoming and integrating these communities, I think it's a fine line in the language we use. It has to be welcome and integration together, joining the UK community and local communities. At the same time, not pushing people, and there might be some people that react negatively to being told, now you are part of the United Kingdom, right? And so I think the messaging needs to be delicate in this sense, and how integration is, also approached. I can see that being a backlash in the community, specifically if we consider, again, the Ukrainian community is actually its largest in the Northwest. It's very much the Red Wall community. Many, as we know, of the Ukrainian diaspora were in fact Conservative Party voters, and these were exactly the sorts of people that were critical of other immigration policies in the past. I think we have to balance how we communicate with them about the Ukrainian population. So the messaging, I'm not an expert in here, but I think it will, I can already see in our community attempts to organize these organizations that there is a little bit of anger when people are told that this is their new home, because they don't see it that way. So I guess some sensitivity to that. They may in fact stay and fully integrate into UK society, but I think messaging needs to be careful.
I've got two questions for you, if I may. Could you just say a little bit more about the issue that you raised with regards to existing Belarusian, Russian and Ukrainian students who are here? If you could say a little bit more about that and what we need to do, because that's not an immediate problem today, but it's a problem that's going to emerge if the conflict runs on. So that's point number one. And could you also just say a little bit, we've talked about the mental health of people who are arriving here, but I just wondered if you could comment in respect of what we need to do in terms of education to, and I'm thinking particularly of children in a primary school here who are going to have children who are fleeing a war coming into their classroom, and what do we need to do to ensure that they're not singled out, but that the children around them, the British children around them already, have an understanding and appreciation, and what do we need to do as a society to deal with that particular point?
So yes, about the international students, Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. So it is our estimation that there are thousands. We are contacting our universities to be able to identify exactly how many individuals we're talking about. Not all, especially not all of the Russian and Belarusian students would indeed intend to stay. In the past, they would be eligible for graduate scheme visas, but it is a question of how the government wants to deal with a population that will effectively be displaced and refugees. Is the graduate scheme most appropriate in that case or not? What we do know is that the Ukrainian students are very lost. They're not necessarily, so far the higher education sector is not coordinated in this sense, and they do not necessarily know who to turn to in their universities to ask about what will happen to them in the next few months. And so any clarity that could be offered to them, I think would...
Do you think that coordination in the higher education sector needs to come from the sector itself, or do you think that needs to come top down from government?
I think the education sector is very much responsive to government policy on visa schemes and specifically students' right to stay, whether it comes to graduate scheme or not. So I think universities, whilst they can support the mental health and well-being of their students currently and that are enrolled, and any future students, I don't think they would have the capacity to advise on what steps to follow next. And I think any clarity that could be offered on that would be helpful. In terms of the under 18 children that would be entering into education, and also UK children, already there have been quite successful buddy programs across Germany and Poland, where students are paired up with, these are not connected to the sponsors, but in fact, students in school are partnered. Very successful right now in Poland, where Polish children are buddied up, they become friends, they tell each other about their experiences. Of course, the young children are, the local Polish children, it is explained to them that these are our new friends that are having a hard time. And this has proved already to be quite successful. Also in Germany and in Poland, there have been some attempts to provide, at least at the local authority level in the respective context, some Ukrainian language education locally. And I think particularly because we know that the diasporic networks will attract large numbers of Ukrainian displaced peoples, that there will be clustering. There are some local authorities that will be more particularly affected by the presence of underage children going into education.
Thanks, Olga. I can see that Krish Kandia has now joined us. Krish, thank you for joining us. I'm not quite sure at which point you were able to join us. So
it's very late. I apologise.
How much you've actually heard of the discussion. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I don't know if you need me to repeat the questions
could
that
you? Yes.
posed at the outset. So basically, what do we know already? What lessons can we learn from the Afghan, Hong Kong and Syrian schemes? And what can this scheme that's being launched by the government bring? And what are we missing in terms of social integration?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. And I'll do my best to answer
Well,
it.
I tell you what, do you want to give those questions a thought for a moment? And I'll turn to
Yes, go for it.
Steve from British Future, and then I'll come back to you, Krish. Steve, just to try and draw some of the threads and comments together from the discussion, have you got any questions that you'd like to pose? Have you got any findings that you are able to pull together from the discussion?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to be echoing quite a lot of what others have said, I think, just because it's been such a sort of sensible and contentful discussion. I'd certainly echo what Luke was saying about public support. And we were polling public support for refugee protection prior to the refugee crisis. The fieldwork was done before this all happened, and found very strong support. 75% of people agreeing with the principle of supporting refugees, and you know, that will have only gone up. And we also found, when we were doing focus groups during the Syrian crisis, that, you know, having the images of what people are fleeing on TV screens does make a difference. People just understand why people are coming here and what's going on, and that does make a difference. And obviously that salience contributes to this big outpouring of public support. I think one of the questions I have is, which we've touched upon a little, is what about people who would like to do something to help but haven't got spare room, or, you know, can't quite go the full extent of 6 months with a new family in their house, but they'd like to do something. And one thing, of course, they could do is support the people who have got a new family in their house for 6 months. And so how do you make that work? Is there a way for people to, for example, sort of name a friend when they're making their applications, or sort of bring a little support group with them? Or could they even get matched up with a support group when during the application process? I thought something Tim said, which I thought was really interesting, was just if we've got people who have gone through some of the previous schemes and have learned an enormous amount about how you help a traumatized family to settle down somewhere.
Or message Gareth Baker.
How do we draw on them as well? So could they offer mentoring, for example? Could you have a sort of mentoring scheme where somebody who's been through resettling a refugee family previously, you know, you have a monthly call with them or something? You could even have a bit of a buddying scheme. Might that be something that's feasible, and could we set that up? So how do we offer some of the support to those who are doing this? I also thought, what can we learn as well from some of the other schemes? You know, the support for new arrivals from Hong Kong. That was it's been a huge undertaking and a very generous offer to Hong Kongers, but there has been support put in place, a decent amount of money, quite a well thought through integration plan. How can we learn from that for this scheme, and see and sort of look at the read acrosses? And actually, most people I've spoken to say that the Syrian resettlement scheme was well resourced and well planned. How do we learn from that, but do it at pace? Because that's the big difference, is we need to make this work quickly, as Tim was saying. So those would be my questions. I also just wondered if anyone had any contributions about English language teaching as well, because we know that ESOL, English as second language provision, is not strong enough across the UK, and is really going to come under strain if we have large numbers of people who need support with English language. So how could we mobilise perhaps some of this new outpouring of support? Because everybody could offer people some help with English language teaching. And actually, I mean, university students, looking at the higher education sector, university students would be incredibly well placed to support people in English language learning. They're not trained teachers, but they could certainly help with conversation classes, for example. So how do we use this as an opportunity, I think, to really mobilise some of this support and get people to volunteer when they haven't got a room to offer?
Thanks, Stephen. You've just posed a question in my mind, really. We're talking about English as a second language, and you can kind of think of those environments where that's going to be immediately accessible, sort of in terms of the workplace or in a school. and what do we do in terms of much older people who have perhaps been less exposed to foreign languages that are perhaps arriving here, the elderly population? And I just wonder if there's a discussion that needs to be had with people like Age UK in that particular area to try and make sure that people of that generation that arrive here are properly integrated as well. Krish, I'm hoping that you've had a chance to sort of gather some
yes.
thoughts. So apologies
Thank you,
for
Peter.
again. If you could give us your contribution, that would be great.
Sure, and I'm so sorry I wasn't able to hear everybody else's contribution. So if I repeat yours, I hope you hear it as an agreement and cheering you on. Let me think about 3 areas. So I'm going to use the first heading as evacuation. So a lot of people are worried that the government scheme has been hastily put together. It's interesting. Some of the people that are complaining that it's been hastily put together were also arguing the government was really slow. And you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't sometimes, which seems a bit unfair. I think we need to see this as part of an evacuation. And in an evacuation, you can't do things as perfectly as you want to, but speed is of the essence. We saw that with Afghanistan. There were definitely some things that went wrong, like choosing to evacuate cats and dogs rather than people. That was definitely a nightmare. But a lot of really good things happened that we managed to get people to safety very quickly, and I think that's important. You know, the fact that places like Warsaw and in Poland and, you know, Moldova are coping with such large quantities of people means that some of the normal procedures that we would like to undertake need to be paused, I would say. And, you know, that's no excuse for shoddy work, but it means I can cope with the government, you know, revealing things that some are describing as half-baked. I think it's just the nature of the beast. Phase 1 seems to be focusing on a quick win, I guess, people that already know people in Ukraine, and that's going to make some of the pain of the matching process less painful because you know them already. You're willing to take the risk because there's a relationship there. That does seem to make sense to me, but I think there has been, we've seen it at Sanctuary Foundation, a huge outpouring from people that would like to get involved to help. And when we polled our group, we've got 21,000 people that have said they want to become sponsors. You know, last time we polled them, 97% didn't know anybody. So at the moment, those people think there's nothing they can do. Well, actually, there's loads they can do. They just can't get involved in phase 1 yet. And then we know, I'm working very closely with Reset. There are other charities out there that are looking at matching processes. Great. You know, as long as they're as safe as they can be and secure as they can be under the circumstances, this is going to be a win. We can kind of get people out. So that's evacuation. Second area is accommodation. We know from the Afghan resettlement that accommodation really has been a nightmare. And the issues that the Afghans have faced are, you know, being in temporary accommodation, and temporary has suddenly turned into 7 months. But we kind of knew that because that's what happened with Grenfell. A temporary accommodation ended up lasting, you know, over a year. And it's very difficult for families to rebuild their lives in a temporary location. So that was true of hotels. 11,500 people still in hotels, 4.7 million pounds a day. When you add that up, that's over what, 600 million pounds spent. My suggestion at the early part of the evacuation from Afghanistan, when we knew this was going to be a problem, is that just go to the open market rental sector and rent people's houses, pay the benefit gap difference, and you will save a fortune on using hotels. And we didn't do that. We haven't found a way to do that. There's been a difficult, complex relationship between central government and local government about who's responsible. I think we need the kind of visionary scale that we saw from government on getting the homeless into hotels during the COVID crisis. It's that kind of mindset that we need.
Krish, can I just ask you a little bit on that? And I should tell you that Monica from Reset was here earlier, but she had to leave, so you've missed each other.
Yeah, sorry.
You raise a really important issue about homes and people who are still in hotels. I have a situation in my constituency where my local authority has come forward, volunteered property,
Yeah.
and they've been offered to a number of families, but they've been declined, and those families have decided to stay in London in the hotel and have refused to take up that accommodation that's been offered. And I can kind of understand that. You know, you've arrived in a foreign country, your only familiarity is with the capital city of a country, and they're proposing that you get shipped to a northern cold
Sure.
red wall seat that you've never heard of before.
Yeah.
So how do we overcome that problem? And your suggestion about renting homes is a very sensible one. But where do we actually locate those homes? Do we rent homes in Darlington, for example, or do we only rent them near those capital cities that are familiar to people?
It's a really good point, Peter. And there, you know, there's multi-layered here that we need to get into. So very quickly, when the crisis happened, I asked the National Residential Landlords Association to work with me, and they were brilliant. Within 24 hours, 500 landlords came to an online seminar, and they all had the same issues, more or less. They were very willing to do it. Their perception was, don't trust the local authority to pay a reasonable rate for rental, and some of it put them in financial difficulty. They couldn't afford to rent it because of the mortgage payments on their property, some of them. And secondly, and this is prejudice, but you know, you've got to deal with reality, landlords were nervous for the refugee to be the guarantor. They wanted the local authority to do that. And if the local authority could do that, they felt more confident to be able to step forward. So, you know, there is, if you Google it, there are enough properties out there within the UK that are rentable right now to house all the Afghans. And I haven't checked recently how we're doing in terms of housing Ukrainians, but that is possible. And the Ukrainians don't need the same kind of properties that Afghans need. Afghans need, in general, you know, place for 8 people, 2 adults, 6 children, same as my family size. The Ukrainians seem to be coming in smaller family groups of maybe 1 mother and a few children. So, you know, they fit well within the available property matrix, I would suggest. Overcoming where people want to live, that is more complicated. But for me, it's going to be that, like, we're in evacuation mode. Having people live in your house for 6 months, you know, most of us could do what we can. We've put our names down. We don't know how we're going to manage it, but we'll find a way if it means people can get out of Ukraine. But having a quick transition to, you know, normal housing is essential for people feeling like they're going to belong here for any length of time. And originally, when I heard the plan being developed, it was that they would have full recourse to public funds, which would include housing benefit. And what you needed then to provide from the host was a safe landing space so that they weren't going to end up in a hotel or on the streets, but they had a home they could live in. But you as a family could help them transition to their own accommodation. Now, I haven't seen the detail yet of what happens at the end of the 6 months, but I'm interested about whether they can then rent properties for themselves. But if they could start that earlier, that might help people that are experiencing trauma, not to have that compounded by living in too close a proximity with a host family and feeling like they're, you know, don't really belong. Last bit, integration. I mean, the government has done a really good job offering integration funding. Who is it that said that? Steve said that, for kind of welcome projects. I've been working on welcome projects for Hong Kongers, and we've identified 3 key areas that they need help with integration on. The first one was social integration. We're running a whole bunch of, you know, festivals, street parties that the host community can actually welcome this new group of Hong Kongers. It's been estimates are around 100,000 in the last year. That's a very large migration. And if we can celebrate it, that's fantastic. We've also developed a welcome course that we've deliberately made useful, not just for new arrivals from Hong Kong, but it would work with Afghans and it would work with Ukrainians about, you know, just getting to know what it's like to live here, spotting the stages of culture shock, you know, how you navigate some of our public systems. We can do that in a really friendly way. And there are loads of community groups that would love to run that for them. Second area we've been working on is educational integration. I'm sure you've been talking about that. I'm hoping you're talking to Catherine Gladwell at the refugee education charity. They're experts in this and have been doing it for a long time. But you know, our job has been working with teachers to equip them, because you know, children are going to be in their classrooms. How do we help them understand working cross-culturally, how to spot trauma, how to have a more kind of therapeutically informed, trauma-informed approach to dealing with children, because it will be mainly, I think the majority of people coming will be children, won't they, with adults. And the third area is professional integration. What can we do to facilitate these guys into the workforce? And I'm hoping at least phase 2 or phase 3 of the government's plan will take up the huge numbers of businesses that have said they wanted to help. But we can bridge that. There's stuff that civil society together with business can do to help government help people into work where it's needed. You know, if it's mainly women with children, that could be complicated. But I'm also seeing the huge value of work for people that are traumatized, because if you're sat at home with nothing to do but watch the television 24/7, that's really tough. And so, you know, meaningful work can be actually a therapy in itself.
Thanks, Chris. We have talked about orientation and English as a second language in a number of other contributions. I'm going to turn to Sunda now, who is safely back from the schoolroom. Sunda, I know that you've been following all of the meeting, although you weren't visible for all of it. So just come to you for your contribution in respect of the discussion that we've been having, and any particular key points and thoughts that you want to draw out of the panel that haven't already been covered that you think would be beneficial in putting together a sensible report of advice on policy in this area at this time.
Yes, thanks so much, Peter, and for everyone's contributions, which have been tremendous. I think there's an initial point here about priorities. And right now it's about getting this scheme working at pace, and then making the links across different schemes is also great. I think we have all been a bit frustrated that it hasn't been quick enough. And so we shouldn't start saying, you know, are we going too fast? But you know, it's happening very fast. Just a couple of priorities. I mean, it's great basically to have a sponsorship scheme if we're going to go down a sponsorship scheme that is nothing like the sponsorship schemes we've had in the past, because they have been brilliant for the people who've done them and managed to do them. But we really have put people through a year or 2 years of really hard work to be able to host a family. We've gone to completely the opposite end. I think Britain has gone from the heaviest, sort of most onerous sponsorship scheme in the world to the lightest touch scheme in the world overnight. And, you know, there might be a balance. Just 2 little tweaks I'd like to make to the current sponsorship scheme. One is, I think it'd be quite good when people put themselves down. So it's a single sponsor. You're going to need other people around you. It'd be really good to say, just name 3 or 4 people who are going to help you. Because in the US and in Canada, there are sponsor circles of 5 people. But if you just have to name the 4 people who are going to help, and the person you're hosting gets 4 other names as well. And if you just end up too busy at work to sort of talk to them, they've got some other names and so on. I just think that would help people think about what can other people do. And the other just very little tweak I'd like to see is just a box on the form that says, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. We'll try and match you up. By the way, not everyone might get a refugee straight away because there's such a supply of people wanting to do it. In principle, would you be willing to be involved in other schemes and other groups? Because lots of people will tick that box. And then we would have an option to say, are some of these people relevant for some of the Afghan group in hotels? It might not work for everybody. And I think we would get over one of the issues of, you know, we want to get this right for everybody. We've got schemes for Hong Kongers, schemes for Afghans, schemes for Ukrainians. This is where the pressure is. I think lots of people would tick that box, and I think it would diffuse some of the concerns about that. But the biggest issue, which Olga's doing brilliant work in universities, we need people to do this. How much Britain contributes now in this crisis will depend on how many people from Britain step up. That isn't the problem, clearly, overnight. And how well matched we are to our Ukrainian friends, who we don't know yet. And we need to therefore really focus now on the matching mechanisms. And people are going to find it confusing that they have to find their own person. I was posing this on Friday, that this was a better way to do it than to have one list of 500,000 people at Michael Gove's department, another list of 250,000 people at the Home Office, and that would have got terribly stuck. So we haven't made that mistake. but we've actually got a lot of work to do, and government really needs to invest at pace in our knowledge of Ukrainian communities, maybe our knowledge of Polish communities, maybe Polish Catholic Mission have been raising money for Ukrainians, can really help us. We really need to know who can help us get the message that if you're, and where are you? You might be in Ireland because you wanted to come to Britain. You might be in Poland, you might be in Moldova. Who can get this message out that you're welcome? And what's happened in universities is so important. We need to see that happen in agriculture. That matching is the crucial thing. Peter, we did a lot of work with you about COVID. So there was some disappointment when everybody wanted to volunteer and some people didn't get to volunteer. And it will be a tragic use of this moment. Not everybody can volunteer with a room, not to put to use all of the offers that we get and to collect all of the offers. So I think those are the urgent points. And then we broaden out. I think give sponsors help. You know, there should be Zoom calls to listen to people who've done it before. But if sponsors name other people, and if sponsors can meet other sponsors, networks for sponsors to talk about how it's going, maybe networks for Ukrainians to talk about how it's going. I just think making it less the individual has taken on this big task, but that the individual has done it, but the individual is part of a community. I thought Olga's points were brilliant about messaging towards Ukrainians. We need to make this offer well to Ukrainians. We should really listen to that and craft some messaging. We want Ukrainians to feel at home in Britain while they have to be here. You know, that might deal with the point that we heard. Let's get those messages right. So I think over time we should make links across all of these schemes, because government's doing a lot at once, but there are some things we can get right in this scheme at pace. And the biggest thing I think will be getting business to link up. It wants to offer people jobs because there are jobs that it wants doing in hotels and everywhere else. And linking up the jobs to the accommodation issue, and the jobs to the accommodation issue, particularly to the childcare issue, because you know, this is a group mainly of women and children and elderly people. If business can understand that it's part of a humanitarian scheme here, and it will get to fill some of the jobs it is struggling to fill as well. But this is a humanitarian scheme in which employers can play a part. If we get that right, Peter, universities, businesses, charities, I think we could see a really effective scheme that we could learn from for everybody else. But you know, it's having to be done in real time.
Thanks, Sunder. I really like the point about that support network that sponsors should be able to talk about having, because I think that's important, that they're not isolated and alone in this task. I also like the opportunity for people to actually say, I haven't got a refugee this time, but I'll help with something else, or I could contribute in some other way. And I think that's a great way of marshalling that. The link up with business is absolutely crucial. And I think businesses are seeing this as an opportunity to be able to fill some of their vacancies. And we know that when people are working and they're occupied, that they become much more integrated into society. I just want to pose one last question to people as we sort of move towards the conclusion. And I've just had a message to say Tim wants to come in, but before I bring Tim back in, can I just pose this question? I am actually the only member of Parliament who's actually on the call. Sadly, we haven't got any other colleagues. I am looking forward to a meeting that's being hosted in Parliament tomorrow with a number of Ukrainian MPs who are visiting us tomorrow. So that will be quite interesting to hear from them how they think that we can help their citizens integrate here whilst they are here. But what do the panelists think that members of Parliament in their respective constituencies can do, both in the short term and the medium term, to help these schemes and help that integration in their respective communities? I'm going to go to Tim. If you've got a burning desire to respond to that particular question, do put a message in the chat. But I'm going to go to Tim now because he's got his hand up. Tim.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I just wanted to come in because I just think Sunder's point is so well made, and actually isn't in any sense a contradiction to what I was saying about the fact that there's a lot of people out there who've already, ordinary people, volunteers on community sponsorship schemes and others, who already have quite a lot of experience of welcoming refugees into their communities. So at one level, it would be nice to utilise all of that experience and match it up with the offers of accommodation, but perhaps inevitably it won't be as neat as that. And one of the things that inevitably comes up is that if there is an offer of accommodation from an individual, then the help needs to be close by. And by close by, I mean really close by. Not necessarily in the same street, town or district, but in the neighbouring streets. Because realistically, if you're going to help with orientation and GP registrations, getting the kids into school and just cooking a meal or helping them go to the park, you need to be quite close by. But the good news about what Sundar's saying is that expertise is everywhere. Although, although there's a great pool of it that's already had the experience of welcoming a refugee, there'll be lots of people who haven't had an experience of welcoming a refugee, but they're perfectly capable of doing it. That's what the schemes so far have shown us they can do. Because a mantra we've had from community sponsorship, which we've learned over the time, is you do not need to help a refugee settle in your community successfully, an expert in refugees or conflict or resettlement or refugee trauma. There are people who behind the scenes be helpful with all of those things. You need to be an expert in your community. And all that means is need to know where the schools are, you need to know where the bank is, the shops, that sort of thing. And if you've got that expertise, you've got quite a lot of what you need to successfully welcome a refugee family to your area. So I think that point of saying, when you apply to be a sponsor and offer accommodation, can you name a few people who would help you out, would just be such a useful one, and really quickly cut to this from being an isolated thing where it's a household or a landlord looking after a refugee family on their own, to it being a genuine community effort, which I think is so essential.
Sundar's got his hand up.
Yeah, just Peter, on what MPs can do. MPs are going to do loads here, and MPs are brilliant because MPs will take this along with councillors and other people. They will take it to 650 different communities in Britain, and they will be the point of advice to communities. So I think the more that you with colleagues can really drill down on some very practical questions, and the questions people have are, how do I find my Ukrainian? And there are, ways that we can do that. I'd like to do it, but it feels like a big responsibility. What help and support can I get? Can we connect sponsors with sponsors in your own area? There'll be different people sponsoring in Darlington, there'll be specific, and can we have a bit of that?
Well,
can we have a bit of the network? And then I haven't got a spare room, but I'd like to help. What can I do? And you can turn up and be on part of Team Welcome and get behind the sponsors. I think if we're really tangible about what you can do to have those links, obviously the people with links to Ukraine are going to be enormously important to everyone else who wants links. So the MPs will have to make those links. Like Ukrainian communities, there's such pressure, and they're not the strongest or most established communities, and so MPs can say to them, what support do you need? Council can say, what support do you need? So just being really crunchy about those different needs that we're asking people to have.
Yeah. Just in terms of my own experience, we know that there are 20 Ukrainian families already living in my constituency, and we know that a handful of them work with one particular employer, so we were able to reach out to that particular employer and offer help and assistance. Sadly, we weren't able to get a sharing of the data from the local authority who knew who those families were, so we weren't able to make that direct contact with them. So maybe there's something to comment on and recommend in terms of some data sharing with people, a little bit like we did at the beginning of COVID in terms of getting those shielding protected people. I can see Olga's got her hand up. I'm conscious that we've been on for over an hour and a half now. I know we had some difficulties, so could I ask you, if you want to say anything further, you make this your last contribution and we try and draw it to a conclusion. Equally, if you have got additional information that you've not had the chance to share, then please do feed it into Lucy, Steve and Sundar at British Future. I'm sure that it will make our final report. So Olga, over to you.
So I should probably disclose that I was once a refugee that was sponsored to come from Eastern Europe to Canada, and then the rest is history, because longest period of my life I've spent here in the United Kingdom. So much of the stories we're talking about was my own life lived experience. But here, in terms of what MPs can do, well, we are, as I said, we're trying to coordinate across the entire United Kingdom, all of the different Ukrainian community organizations, religious organizations, university student societies, as well as academics who have knowledge about Ukraine or the Ukrainian diaspora. Of organizations alone, we've identified 40. If that includes religious organizations, we are in upwards of around 60, right? So once we meet on Friday together, I'd be more than happy to share this information to MPs. We have separated them out across the different regions of the United Kingdom, and therefore MPs could contact directly these organizations, and we can, even my students could help set up meetings. I think lastly, the higher education sector here is going to be a very useful partner. As Sundar already said, student societies specifically are ready and willing to help and support. They are not the types of individuals that will be able to host a refugee family themselves, but they can actually help in the community outreach locally. So I think that getting almost every single university right now has a Ukrainian society in it. So that would cover a great many MPs across the country in their constituencies as well.
Thanks, Olga. Do we have some final comments from anyone else on the call? No? Anthony, you've popped your hand up.
Hi, yeah, just basically, I would like to say, kind of, obviously agree with a lot of the stuff that's been said today. And the one thing I would certainly sort of advocate that, as part of that business community, there is so much sort of support for what is going on and to help. Business is desperate to help. We have roles that we want to help, but we need the sort of the levers that government, as much as they can do, to help us, get people into jobs. Some of the things, one of the things that we've done recently is the sector's put out an immigration fact sheet, which is free to use, for what it means for Ukrainians in country in Ukraine at the moment, and those that are actually currently in the UK. We need to get that sort of translated. But there is a huge, I think, there's a huge amount of momentum within the business community to help. So, very much sort of welcome anything that you can do to kind of to help sort of that process of getting people in, and then us helping them into meaningful employment.
Thanks, Anthony. And I think that's a really important point. Just as we saw with COVID, the response from businesses can be phenomenal and can be a complete game changer in things. So that's certainly something that I know that we will be focusing on in our report. Can I thank everybody for joining us this afternoon? It's been hugely informative. It's incredibly timely, the discussion that we've been having. It's been very helpful to me, and I know that the team at British Future will have gathered plenty of evidence to help inform this debate, and I'm sure that we will be able to circulate our final report with you once we draw that together. So thank you, and if there is any further points, please don't hesitate to feed them in afterwards. So thank you very much.